Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Prevention Matters panel session. This series is a monthly online panel that's hosted by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, where we dive into what it really means to prevent homelessness in our various communities. Most of us know that prevention is necessary if we want to solve the current housing crisis. But the series exists because if we want to address homelessness through prevention, we must be clear on what prevention means. So, what can we do to reduce the chances that someone will experience homelessness in the first place? What can be done to support people who are at high risk of homelessness or who have recently become homeless? And how can we ensure that people who have experienced homelessness and who are now housed don't face it again? Prevention Matters is an online panel series where we dive into what this really means by highlighting groundbreaking prevention initiatives in Canada and beyond. Evictions, which are a key pathway into homelessness, are unfortunately rising across the country at a very alarming rate. And with our current affordable housing crisis, it's no surprise that we are seeing an increase in the number of people who are being displaced and therefore facing homelessness right across the country. There can sometimes be a tendency in the sector to focus our attention on bigger cities because they are more densely populated, and as a result, they can appear to be impacted more severely. However, larger societal problems like the current housing crisis don't just show up in big cities. It hurts communities across the board, including the smaller ones that aren't populated as densely. To examine this issue a little more, today's conversation will focus on evictions, displacement, and how these issues can look in some of the smaller cities that can sometimes get overlooked. We're going to explore the harmful tactics that are used by landlords, their impact on individuals and communities, and solutions that can preserve affordable housing before the current crisis gets any worse. So, I'm very excited to share that today we'll be joined by members of the Many Faces of Urban and Rural Displacement Project, a project which examines how displacement happens and how it affects our communities across Ontario. Specifically, we'll be joined by the brilliant Yvonne Kelly, Brian Doucet, and Dylyn Reid-Davis, who will introduce themselves more to you shortly. I'm also pleased to share that today's conversation will be hosted by Steve Gaetz, who many of you already know is the president and CEO of the COH. Hi, Steve. Can we get a wave?
Hey,
And so you'll be seeing more of him in just a bit. Before we get into it, I wanted to remind you that these sessions are not your typical webinar. Your participation is a key part of this experience, and so we strongly encourage you to engage among yourselves in the chat and ask any and all questions you might have during our open Q&A in the second half. I also wanted to remind you that your feedback is very important to us. So if you have any thoughts on how we could improve your experience, we'd really appreciate you sharing them with us. Please take a moment to make use of our feedback form in the chat because we really do want to hear from you. This session will be recorded and shared publicly on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to maintain your privacy, I'll invite you now to turn off your video and rename yourself using the tools at the bottom of the screen. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please reach out to myself or my wonderful colleague Steph, who said hi in the chat, and we'll be able to help you out. Since we're gathering online today, a single land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our many locations. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is based in York University, Toronto, and so we will share their land acknowledgement. However, we invite all of our guests to consider their position regarding the land in which they find themselves. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And so, without further ado, I'll be handing today's session over to Steve and our panelists. Thank you so much for hosting today's conversation, Steve, and to our wonderful guests from the Many Faces of the Urban and Rural Displacement Project, Yvonne Kelly, Brian Doucet, and Dylyn Reid-Davis. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing more about your work. We look forward to learning from you today. Over to you, Steve.
great. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation we're going to have today. It's this project sounds very interesting and kind of gets at like one of the key areas that we need to improve our work on the prevention of homelessness. But what I'm going to do first is ask the presenters to introduce themselves and say a bit about what you do, and then we'll get into the project. So we'll start with you, Yvonne,
Thanks,
as I've
Steve.
known you the longest.
And I normally don't sound like this as well. I hope my voice will last long enough for the webinar. So my name is Yvonne Kelly, and I'm the current chair of the Social Planning Network of Ontario. We have 13 active social development and social planning councils across Ontario, doing important work, including social research, equity and anti-poverty work, education, advocacy, and coalition building. We want to strengthen communities in every way possible. So we recognize that this housing crisis was happening right across all of our 13 communities, including the ones that we're talking about today, not just in the bigger cities. And we thought we wanted to learn more about how that was happening and the impact. So the 4 SPCs that joined this work included Cornwall, York Region, Oxford County, and Kingston and District. So they were particularly interested in collaborating on a joint project. So we applied to CMHC, to their Tenant Initiative Fund, and we partnered with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights and with University of Waterloo, where Brian is from, as well as SDC Waterloo, where they'd done an incredible amount of work on displacement when the LRT was built there. So we were successful in getting our grant, which was quite exciting. And we started the project on April 1st, 2022. The project was driven by a provincial steering committee, and we hired a project coordinator to lead us through. Each individual community hired their own project leads and parent or community ambassadors to do outreach. Each area interviewed individuals with lived experience of displacement and worked on the ground to build those relationships with leaders and politicians and anyone doing the work in those areas. So they've continued to use their report findings to highlight and advocate for the need for change locally, provincially, and federally. So it's been a real honor to be part of this project at all levels.
Great, thank you. Dylyn, why don't you go next?
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you all. My name is Dylyn Reid-Davis. I am a tenant based in Kingston. I'm a recent sociology grad from Queen's University. I am a tenant organizer, housing researcher, and in this past couple of years, I've been the local engagement coordinator for the Social Planning Council of Kingston and District and with the Social Planning Network of Ontario on this project. My role as Yvonne has touched on, has been to be an ambassador for this project to the tenants in the community. As a tenant, I've seen what it's like to be renting in our city, and I know intimately the problems that we face, the landlords that we have, and the housing options that we have before us. So I understand that tenant mobilization and capacity building was really an essential component of this project alongside this research. Research for the benefit of tenants is really essential. It breaks tenants out of this isolation, showing that they're not the only ones facing displacement, which is so common, especially in smaller communities, where there's a deafening silence over what tenants can actually talk about. And each community approached this issue differently. So Oxford County did a peer support program. Kingston did a peer-led tenant rights workshop. We all took different strategies in order to engage our tenant communities.
Great. Well, thank you. Brian.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. My name is Dr. Brian Doucet. I am an associate professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. I previously held the Canada Research Chair in Urban Change and Social Inclusion. I'm originally from Toronto, and prior to coming to Waterloo back in 2017, I was based in the Netherlands for over a decade with some, doing my PhD and some research over there. A lot of my work focuses on housing, gentrification, displacement, in particular, trying to focus on the things that aren't necessarily visible within statistics. When we talk about housing, when we talk about the way in which cities are changing, particularly from a planning or policy perspective, we tend to rely on data, on numbers. And my research is really based on, not saying that numbers aren't important, right? We have a census is very, very important, but it doesn't show everything, and it doesn't show everything as it's happening. And so a lot of my research focuses on very qualitative methods, on visual methodology. I produced a book a couple years ago about visual change in Toronto, and particularly on the housing side, the things that aren't going to show up in the census, whether that be more displacement than is visible within statistics, the lived experiences for tenants, the fractured relationship between landlords and tenants. And so I do a lot of work with nonprofits and with community groups. On this project, I was the academic advisor, helping to bring some of the different groups together on this project. And as Yvonne said, worked previously in Waterloo looking at change along the light rail transit corridor. And again, my main focus is housing, and I'm actually just finishing up making a documentary film about housing, which, all being well, will be released later this year.
Wow. This is a very interesting panel. So thank you, all of you, for introducing yourselves and letting us know a bit more what you are interested in and what you do. Now I'm going to ask a series of questions that we've prepared here. And the questions I ask, I'll want to hear from all of you. So that's important. And then once we've gone through our prepared questions, then we're opening it up to people through the chat and who are watching, to have them weigh in on this. So the first question I have has to do with the origins of this project. What inspired this work? What was driving it? And when was all of this happening? And how did you move towards project as an idea? So I'm going to mix it up in terms of order. So I'll start with you, Dylyn, and I'm interested to hear what you say. Then we'll move it around.
Yeah, so I can kind of speak to my impression as a tenant and why we would need a project like this. And then the fantastic opportunity to actually participate in a project like this. I think that small communities are very overlooked, as we've mentioned. There's an abundance of research on larger communities. As a tenant in a smaller community, from moving from Toronto to a smaller community, it was hard to go from a place where there was abundant resources, abundant support, abundant histories of tenant organizing and strategies of resistance, to a community where this was more subdued, where this was currently being built, but not something that had a fleshed out legacy that we were able to draw on easily. For instance, in Toronto, I would work with Acorn, a robust tenant organization. But moving to Kingston, we didn't have anything like that. We had a tenant union in the works, but it just emerged through the pandemic. So few tenants in smaller communities can speak out because the rental landscape is so small, and there's huge fear of retribution. When there's only a few landlords controlling the majority of the rental housing market, especially the affordable rental housing market, you want to keep silent and preserve your options for the future because you just do not know what's going to happen. And this leaves most tenants' stories untold. And so being able to help tenants such as myself and others who've experienced displacement, who've experienced unequal relations with their landlords is really essential. And I've been just very fortunate to participate in something like this.
So you raised some very interesting points about the differences between larger cities and small when it comes to supports, and what that means in practical terms. We'll be coming back to that throughout. Brian, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I mean, I can trace some of the origins for me of this research to one paragraph, basically, in a report produced by the Regional Waterloo that was monitoring change happening along our new light rail transit corridor. And it was using a bunch of metrics, and they're all very good metrics and data points to look at change that was happening. And this is going back a few years. I think the report came out in about 2017 or so. And it basically said, the data is indicating that average incomes are rising, right? And this might be gentrification. but we see little statistical evidence, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I don't remember the exact word for word, very little statistical evidence of displacement. Therefore, we should continue to monitor the situation, rather than take any action. And this was fairly soon after I arrived in Waterloo from the Netherlands, and I was getting to know the lay of the land and getting to meet a lot of people, including the excellent team at the Social Development Center of Waterloo region. And, we talk about this quote, and I said, this is what the report's saying, and sort of, this sort of laughter of, well, what do you mean? We're dealing with this all the time. We're seeing displacement. We're seeing housing disappear. We're dealing with tenants who have been evicted and rent-evicted. And it was sort of like, yeah, there is more happening. And so that led to a research project that I did here in Waterloo with the Social Development Center, the local chapter here, where we really tried to uncover, okay, what kind of housing loss is taking place? Not to say we can cover everything, but what are examples of rent evictions and dem evictions? What does this mean for tenants? So we did a lot of interviews with people who really aren't part of the conversation, because of course the narrative at the time and still now was this wave of $3 or $4 billion worth of investment taking place along our new transit corridor, without much consideration for what was lost. And so we tried to produce this counter narrative, not to say we don't need good transit, right? We need good transit, but maybe we need to do other things to ensure that that housing is protected. And that was the starting point. And again, that project sort of fed into this wider one across Ontario, where we've taken some of the approaches that we did here in Waterloo and sort of refined them and, built on them for this project province-wide.
Great. I have just a follow-up question, a research question. I remember several years ago when we were writing our document defining homelessness prevention, I was struck by the lack of research on evictions prevention. Yeah. Does that still stand, you think? Like, it seems to me that obvious thing to do research on. Yeah. And it was.
Yeah, I'm a housing researcher, and there's a whole other sort of silo, let's call it that, of homelessness research. And right. I think the two still don't really come together that much. You've got your housing folks, you've got your homelessness right. folks, where the two are so interrelated, right? The last stop after rent eviction, right, is homelessness. And I think first of all, we need to do a better job of combining those sort of bodies of research. In terms of eviction prevention, yes, I think there is a growing body of research. There are some great researchers, including some of my own colleagues. Some of Martine August's work is really good. Julie Ma at the University of Toronto has been doing some great research on it as well. It's growing, but again, we're so much of what we rely on is data, formal data, and we'll talk about this in more detail in later questions. But formal eviction data, which really only scratches the surface of what's actually happening, right? Most of the stories that we encountered, the experiences, they're not enforced by the courts. They don't show up in a statistical data set on the number of people that have been evicted. So that's important to stress as well.
Yeah, for instance, youth very often are not on a lease. They're staying with friends or a partner and that kind of thing. And so their eviction comes through a breakdown in relationships, and there's no recourse really. So Yvonne, I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I have a feeling you were kind of behind a lot of this. So, so yeah, what's the origin here? What inspired this?
Okay, sorry. I love that Dylyn and Brian talked about the origins in Waterloo and Kingston, even though Waterloo wasn't one of them that we did research in. So I come from York Region in terms of my work. So I'll tell you a little bit about that local, because I think that's important, about how we got to starting this as a broader provincial project. So in York Region in 2020, like a month before COVID struck, we had started the Affordable Housing Coalition of York Region. I'm a co-chair of that till now. And so what we were seeing was rampant evictions. We were seeing low-income communities being targeted for massive buy-ups and rent eviction and resale. And so we really wanted to learn more about that, but also work on the ground to advocate for better policy locally, provincially, and also federally. So meanwhile, back at the SPNO ranch, all of us were looking at this problem right across 13 communities. And I remember the early conversations with Stephanie, who was our ED in Oxford County, and talking about how, well, Toronto has a problem, but you know what, anyone that lives along the 401, all the rents are going up. So as much as people are willing to commute, they're commuting even further now. So as far as Oxford County and London. And so it was like opening up this whole conversation about where are people going and how far are people willing to live their work, for example. So we really started thinking about how do we capture this and where do we start? And I believe it was our contacts at CCHR, Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, that pointed us in the direction of the Tenant Initiative Fund and supported us in looking at that as an option. And so the job then was to decide how wide and how deep do we want to go? Do we want to look at one community? Do we want to look at two? And we landed on looking at 4 communities because we thought we could take the funding that was available and really invest it in 4 communities and dig a little deeper and also have points of comparison, because it was all about looking at communities that are least suspected to have this issue, either because they're urban or they're rural or they're small, or in the case of York Region, 9 municipalities, smaller municipalities with a very a mixture of urban and rural, but also thought to be such a wealthy area that none of these problems existed, which couldn't be further from the truth. So Oxford was on right from the beginning, York Region as well. Kingston's been doing incredible work on housing for 50, 60 years. They've been in operation for close to 100 years. So we always take a lot from their chapter in terms of what's going on in housing in Kingston, especially with a very diverse demographic of folks in university and folks exiting the prison system. And Cornwall was our last one, but what an incredible place to look at this issue, because at the onset of our project, a company from Toronto had purchased a building of 100 units in Cornwall and evicted and give everybody their eviction slips on the very day, on one day. So this was almost exactly when we started the project. So it was like clearly obvious that there was work to be done there. And I will say one other quick thing about this. We all came from those perspectives of wanting to understand this better, wanting to figure out how to prevent it and to inform policy better. I had a unique opportunity because I work for a school board in York Region. This is not the work I do as part of my work there, but working with families who were being evicted and just onslaught of people who were having to leave the region, living in their cars. And so I think all of us were seeing these astronomically devastating situations in our own communities and thought we have enough of a range of issues and causes and impacts that we can actually really tell the story that we think needs to be told about what happens outside of the big cities. So we came together, we formed a steering committee, and we started hiring our local leads. And 3 of them have experience as tenants and experience with eviction. So we really had the people leading the work that understood this from a very personal and experiential place.
That's great. That's great. So hopefully we can talk about all of these different places as we go through. And so I'll throw in some questions every now and then. So you mentioned some of the complexity of York Region, which is all at once a big city with a bunch of smaller cities and a lot of rural areas. So what's also the municipalities that you have different orders of government. You have a regional government and municipalities, all of which can have different bylaws and approaches to everything. So what do you find in York Region that is a positive outcome of this complexity, and what are some of the challenges?
So the positive is a little harder to find. You have municipalities where they are taking much more of a lead on this. and others who aren't. And those that are trying to elevate the discourse around how we use local solutions to like making sure public land is made available. So those challenges have gone out to all municipalities. Not all are as eager to take up that conversation. And then the challenge is that we have a regional government, and so the municipalities look to that regional government to essentially often solve the solution. At the same time that so many of the costs of homelessness and lack of housing are being borne at the front end at the municipal level. So it's a big challenge for anybody who's working in municipalities and regions today, because the cuts have really resulted in a lot more people being forced or faced with this situation. So I'd say the other thing I would tag on with Brian around the whole conversations about housing and homelessness that aren't very integrated. And so we really also, if my CCHR friends were here, they'd be saying we need to implement a right to housing framework so that we have those discussions, whether we're building or we're looking at renovictions, that we're referring to that, because as a guide in terms of how we gradually increase the amount of affordable housing for folks. So we've had conversations, webinars, presentations at the regional level talking about homelessness. And when you interject and say, but let's talk also about what's happening with rampant evictions, let's talk about a 1 or 2% vacancy rate and what that means and how that really gives the edge to anyone who's owning and renting, because there's very little choice for a conversation next week when we're talking about homelessness or when we're talking about housing. And it's like, I find it very difficult to kind of really have a comprehensive, deep conversation about the solutions when we tend to parse out and silo these conversations. So yeah, that's probably what I can think about on that one right now.
Yeah, I think that separation between housing and homelessness in research, it's also reflected in policy. So with the National Housing Strategy, which is doing some things well, other things maybe not as well. But the thing that I always think is that you could add a lot of new housing that's affordable for people like me. But there is no clear mechanisms in the National Housing Strategy to get people who experience homelessness into that housing. Yeah. Right. And so these are challenges.
And without regulation, even the housing we're building will not be affordable for long. So yeah, that's exactly another issue, right? So it kind of gives, I think, anyone in this country now and in our province, around 40% of people are renters. I mean, there's no secure future because you can't predict what your housing costs are going to be ever.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And there's lots of interests, including, homeowners who benefit from a rising cost of housing and would not like to see it necessarily go the other direction. Now, this project involves, by the way, we'll be talking to all of you about where you were at and the factors that define the experience in the regions you live in. But why don't we get to discussing what do we mean by displacement? And what did your project, or what is it starting to find out about the nature of that? What are the causes behind it? And I'll start with you, Brian. You get to go first this time.
Yeah, I mean, at its core, it's an involuntary move.
Right.
Right. It's people who are moving against their desire. They want to remain, and they have to leave their homes for one reason or another. And I think one of the key findings from our research, and this echoes some other studies. But one thing that was really central, I think, is this idea of sometimes what might on paper be a voluntary move, right? If a tenant says, I'm leaving, when you unpack that, And when you actually go into why, and when you, again, this is why we can't just rely on the numbers and the data. When you actually speak to tenants and you learn about the ways in which they interact with their landlords and the ways in which, you see enough of these and you can clearly see different strategies to actually get tenants out, even these, quote unquote, involuntary, or sorry, these voluntary leaves, right? These voluntary moves, quote unquote, are anything but. This is after months or sometimes years of harassment or intimidation, of threats, of formal evictions, right? So we kind of, our research sort of found these semi-formal, or these informal, semi-formal, and formal tactics and experiences. So an informal might just be, a landlord saying, new landlord comes in and say, oh, we're gonna raise the rent, right? We want you out. Here's $5,000 or whatever to get you to leave. And a lot of tenants leave at that stage for a variety of reasons. Now, again, officially, that is a voluntary move. But again, when you speak with tenants, you find that that's not necessarily how they see it, right? And how we should interpret it. Then the semi-formal tactics are more, well, here's an N13 notice or here's an N12 notice, right? And again, for some tenants, simply getting that notice, seeing the writing on the wall is enough for them to say, well, I'm going to take my chances elsewhere, right? I can see that, if this goes all the way through, maybe I end up homeless. So maybe I'm just going to cut my losses and run, right? And again, if that's coupled with a variety of harassment and intimidation tactics that we uncovered in this research, getting an eviction notice is also a moment when people just leave. They often don't know their rights too. They don't know.
That's right.
The eviction notice in and of itself isn't enough for them to leave. They have rights to remain, even if they have an eviction notice given to them, an N12 or an N13, for example. And then the formal tactics when they're pursued through the courts and a court order is issued. I mean, again, that hardly ever happens, but that is the formal, displacement. But so much of what's going on is these semi-formal and informal tactics where, tenants have just had enough and fear the worst, fear something worse coming, or just simply are going to try their luck elsewhere or think, if I go through the courts, I'm not going to get that $5,000 or whatever that the landlord's offering now. I'll at least get something out of this. We see that as displacement. We see that as not a voluntary move. And again, it's important to understand and uncover some of the lived experiences particularly when using this information to help create policy at the local or provincial or national level.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This not a voluntary move. It's a challenge in this area, but also with other public systems where people will be in a program or, it could be a housing program or just a support program. And they're encouraged to leave so that it doesn't look like they were discharged, so it shows up in funny ways. Dylyn, what about you? How do you think about displacement and what are you finding and what's your experience of this in Kingston?
Yeah, so building off of what Brian is saying, like we see just the tip of the iceberg with what we can count. And also I want to highlight that displacement happens incrementally and builds over time. Its causes go so much farther beyond what we currently recognize as a cause for displacement or eviction. For instance, we found in Kingston, a significant proportion of the tenants we spoke to were disabled. And disability is something that's accommodated under the human rights, the Ontario Human Rights Code, in specifically rental housing. And so there's a legal process, a formal process, landlords have to comply with it. There are fines for not complying with it. And so it's not just a matter of being informed. Many landlords know, but despite this, tenants who are disabled continually find themselves being evicted. And so we wonder, okay, what is this issue? It's broader than just this issue of this instance of displacement. It's a systemic issue. The labor being expected of tenants to educate and advocate for basic dignity and the use of their homes they pay for while facing a significant power imbalance sets people up for displacement. And so we saw multiple times tenants going to the Human Rights Tribunal and then being offered a sum of money instead of actually implementing their accommodations. That doesn't change the fact that for affordable rentals, those are significantly rarer and more expensive than what you would find if you were an able-bodied person. And so we see this replicated in a number of other issues, a broader impact of displacement building on other factors outside of this very narrow understanding of what an eviction is, what a displacement is, and what factors can go into that.
Very interesting. Yeah, these are things that I didn't think of, which makes me really glad that this project's happening. Yvonne, what about you?
So I think when we use the word eviction, it still conjures up the idea of like someone lost their house and maybe it was due to something they did. And so eviction seems to be like a one-off, understood as a one-off situation where it wasn't working anymore. And so people had to leave and find another place to live. And that can be the case, but I think sometimes, displacement, which we in this kind of sector do use those two words interchangeably, I think displacement is far less understood. And I'll give credit to my colleague, Alexandra Petrovic from U of Waterloo, who really taught us about displacement and what it meant and how people lost everything because they lost their housing. So eviction and spatial eviction is you lose your room, you lose your home, you lose your apartment. But displacement is much broader, much deeper, much far reaching and comprehensive. So you lose a place to live, you lose connections to your community. So many older people who I talked to in York Region or the interviews that we did spoke of people losing their doctors and doctors that they'd had for 20, 30, 40 years because they had to relocate, not of their choice. And then the other cohort that was really impressed upon us the need to look at this in a different way were single families. And it isn't always single families, it's whole families too. But single-led families, very, very vulnerable because they are also more likely to have a lower income. And so we see children losing their placement in schools. We see people losing their neighborhood connections, their access to medical and physical or medical services. But the school piece is huge for me because we're seeing kids, and a lot of kids, we talk about this a lot, but when you talk about families with kids with special needs, if you're not low income to start out, often that situation can create a family that has lower income. And so these are families that are struggling on a number of, challenges on a number of different fronts. You lose that placement in a class or a special program that your child has looked for and waited for and is now succeeding in school because of, and all of a sudden you have to leave. And there aren't special programs in every school across Ontario. So there's very likely a chance that those children will start over somewhere else, and not just once, but maybe twice or three times. To leave the district, have to leave the region. So we're talking about like a variety of very pervasive circumstances that impact the life of families for years to come. And working with you, Stephen, on youth homelessness and the youth strategy in York Region, we've done a lot of looking at how family homelessness also leads to other issues down the road. It's a clear predictor of involvement with children's aid when it shouldn't be. The family is homeless because of the conditions that we're tolerating in society, but yet that gives them, a pathway to children's welfare. But also it leads to, it's a high predictor of youth homelessness later in life. So we're by not addressing this, we're setting a legacy of expected trauma and expected homelessness and involvement with child welfare that wouldn't be necessary other than the fact that a family has lost their housing. And they know they're going to have to pay more wherever they go, which doesn't, probably means another eviction at some point down the road.
Well, that's something. I mean, that this interaction between different public systems and the consequences of that's really important to understand. Okay. Just 1 second here. I have my questions on my computer, which kind of shut down. While we're waiting for me to get my questions back, I'm interested in Oxford County. How are things, what is distinct about Oxford County and smaller places like that? I imagine there'd be similarities between some things you see in York Region. But.
So Oxford County is like a smaller, it's made up of smaller towns and very rural. And so everyone knows everyone. And it was a very difficult experience for people. Some people chose not to share, be interviewed. They did not want to be recognized as sharing these stories because someone would know a landlord and that would prevent them from probably getting another place to live. And so it was more difficult. They did an incredible job. And their lead coordinator had that experience of being a tenant and having space displacement before. So I think the trust in that relationship was what made it possible to get people to talk about their stories. But I think as a county, as a smaller place, that was a real struggle. And also, I think I remember them talking quite a bit about there tended to be this kind of friction between people moving there for cheaper rent from outside to drive to larger centers for work and those that were living there and had lived there forever. So a lot of the folks that were kind of locked out of even the rental market because of costs were seeing their housing being lost to folks who were coming from outside of the community. And it wasn't like discrimination, but it was feeling like, what happened here? I used to be able to afford to live in my own community and now I can't. And I'm competing with people who are coming from somewhere else who only want to be here because of the cost of housing. They don't want to be here. They'd rather be closer to their work. So it does set communities up against each other when this competition for housing is inevitable.
Right.
Oh,
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add something to that and just sort of building on Yvonne's last point. I mean, this is something that we see in a lot of communities that are sort of 1 to 2 hours away from a major city. And again, it's not just a Canadian phenomenon. We see this in around global cities, you know, in a number of different countries that these big places like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, you know, Toronto, Vancouver in particular have just become so expensive to live in that it's forcing people who otherwise would be able to live closer to the big city to move further and further out. And that has, you know, this has been going on in Hamilton for a while, and now that's spreading further afield. And so we're getting this ripple effect. So it's you know, important to stress that also in places that are a day's drive from any of these big global cities are still experiencing this, right? This isn't an issue that is tied to your proximity to the GTA or to the Lower Mainland. However, we see things maybe more intense because there is this pressure moving further and further out. And it's not necessarily only renters who are moving out, homeowners are moving out, which creates extra pressure on some of these, you know, communities that are 100, 150, even 200 kilometers away from the GTA, that sort of freezes things up in terms of, you know, people who might otherwise be able to move from a rental apartment into home ownership are now competing with people moving often with quite a lot of equity from, say, a condo or a smaller house in the GTA, who are moving to buy property and out, you know, and providing more demand and more competition for those units. We see that here in Kitchener, Waterloo as well, Hamilton, and as well a number of smaller communities like some of the rural ones in Oxford County as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'd say, you know, that people in many situations can work from home now exacerbates that as well, because they're moving to communities of all sizes. We've talked a bit about, actually, Yvonne, you had a really good comment on the impact of being displaced. What are some of the Does anybody want to add anything to that? And the other thing I'd like to have people comment on is in that context, like, is it easy for people to bounce back, or does it become a kind of trauma that really becomes challenging to recover from? I'll open that up to whoever wants to speak to that. Sure, Dylyn.
Yeah, so I think we saw this acutely with people who tried to fight and lost. But overall, you're right, it is a traumatizing experience. Across the board, people reported that after they were displaced, like they lost faith in the systems that were supposedly here to support them. And that has massive impact for their future. If they run into a situation where they find themselves displaced again, they might not be as willing to turn to these supports set out for them because they were not there for them before. We found a number of instances, especially for people who tried to fight, that they felt there was no adequate help for them, or the system was set up for them to fail. Especially, so for instance, one tenant we spoke to is a senior. She's on pension. She just barely did not qualify for legal aid. And unfortunately, because her eviction was a complicated case, it was a personal use case, the chances of her winning that case were seen as lesser than winning, like than losing rather than winning. And so the legal clinic opted not to take her. And so this puts tenants in a position where they are, one, exempt from the supports that are supposed to be here for them. They're still in a vulnerable position. And yet, because their case is not seen as viable, or their fight is not seen as worth it, they're not supported in the way that they need to. And so setting them up for like a future experience where they might not go to these people for help. They might not seek help. They might choose to accept lesser conditions, accept exploitation, accept like poor, low quality housing or higher rents, just because they feel this is the only option and they cannot challenge it. And so, yeah, in absence of having like a tenant advocate voice in our community and other communities that were participating in this project, we found people felt incredibly traumatized and disillusioned after the experience.
Okay, thank you. That's you illustrated that in a way that's very compelling. Anyone else want to speak about this issue of consequences?
So I think Dylyn said it very well, and trauma ran through all of the stories that we talked about, whether it was someone who experienced this for the first time or was feeling threatened by it. And so mental health was just like, it was the second experience really, to having your mental health challenged by what was happening for people. And so these are all costs too. And I think we have to really talk about that when it comes to,
Right.
Like I think, we always know the cost of homelessness is more than the cost of housing people. But when you put people through a number of years of these types of situations, you also create other very costly, beyond just being human tragedies that are unavoidable or that were avoidable. You also cause a lot of costs that you wouldn't otherwise have. And the thing too, it's almost like those who are in decision-making power think that everyone has a car, everyone has someone with a truck that can move them. So if you get displaced, you just drive further to work. But a lot of our clients and those that we interviewed were people who relied on public transit, and they weren't going to be able to drive back to Georgina for a job when they moved to Durham. It just isn't going to happen. So the fact that they have no security of tenure, they know that they're facing increased rental costs, and the average rental increase between tenancies now is 27%, which means some are 10 and some are 50. So you're going from one situation knowing that you're going to have to somehow, pay more, and maybe your income has been disrupted because of it as well. So these all together, these can't be kind of individuated. They all kind of collectively have massive impacts on people. And I can't tell you just the number of families who they might get a little bit of cost help from the region or the municipality for moving costs, but it's down to them to figure out how that's going to happen. And oftentimes they're moving out of area. So it's pervasive. And all of those things are traumatic for anyone who, again, this was not what they hoped to do. They're leaving their home. Who wants to leave their home under the best of circumstances? And now they're leaving their home facing all these new stressors and new challenges.
Great, thank you. Brian, do you want to add anything?
No, I think my colleagues have really covered this issue really well.
Okay, I'm going to have one more question. Then we're opening it up to people who are watching. So please send in your questions and they'll get forwarded to me directly. So this is a question about, you know, what is the nature of supports for eviction prevention? Do you have a sense, like Dylyn, you've been very articulate in suggesting that moving to Kingston, which is hardly a small town, I would say, there's just not supports there. How prevalent are eviction prevention supports, including like legal support, that kind of thing, across the province? Does anyone have a sense on that? If not, that'd be a good social planning council question to kind of map like where it is and where it's absent. Because I often hear stories that, you know, oh, there's eviction prevention programs all over the place. And my feeling is I don't trust that opinion, but I could be wrong. Anybody want to comment on that?
I'll just say a little bit about that. So a lot of our social planning councils are involved on the ground. Some of us have funding, others don't. Kingston and Social Planning Council of York Region are both unfunded social planning councils. So it's largely volunteers that are doing some of these projects and some of this work. But even our legal aid clinics have been defunded to the extent that they can no longer provide this type of education and awareness. Their caseloads are so high that they even have to select and prioritize the types of eviction cases that they can take and the types of cases that they can represent people at the LTB. So their hands are tied. So with the vast increase and the reduction of resources, there's very little that they're often able to offer. And so we've been trying to kind of implement small on the ground community-based information sessions. We work with CCHR, we work with the legal clinic, but again, recognizing their capacity. To us, eviction prevention is about understanding your rights and having the support of your community and others to stand your ground when something is happening. But there's so much more else that could be done. And I know that Brian could maybe talk about Hamilton and their rent eviction bylaw, because otherwise eviction prevention looks very much like individualistic attempts to help people help themselves and stand up to a system that is kind of set up to make them fail. I don't know what else we have, but that's what I see right now.
Okay, that's great. And you tossed a question over to Brian, and then I'm going to have another one for Brian. And then...
Yeah, you lobbed me a nice pitch there, Yvonne. Yeah, I mean, look, at least here in Ontario, we're not going to expect very much from this provincial government in terms of the things that they can do. And they can do a lot. I think things like rent control would be huge, because the incentive to evict tenants, the incentive to force tenants out, is the lack of rent control on a unit when it's vacant, right? That this is where we see the big jumps in rent, right? We don't see jumps in rent so much for tenants who are staying in the same unit. They are largely going up by the guideline, although again, there are above guideline increases that are quite easily permitted. It's when a tenant leaves and a unit becomes vacant. This is where we're really seeing massive jumps in rent. So don't look, again, with statistics, don't look at what the average rent is, because the average rent is the majority of tenants who don't move. Look at what the available rent is. So we're getting a lot of new data, and Steve Pomeroy has been doing some great work on this, looking at rentals.ca. Look at the available rent. And there's a huge difference between what Stats Canada and CMHC say is the average rent that everyone's paying and the units that are actually available. And those jumps take place when a unit becomes vacant. So rent control Again, I'm not expecting very much out of this provincial government, but would be huge. There's very little evidence that suggests this has any impact at all on new construction. In fact, there's some research that suggests actually it helps to spur new construction, because if you're a landlord and you want to make the same amount of profit, you have to have more units to make that profit, right? Because you're making slightly less per unit. So it's really down to cities in this case, in terms of what cities are able to do. And Yvonne did mention Hamilton, and I think, you know, Hamilton's anti-renoviction bylaw, which was passed earlier this year, is one of the most important rules and regulations when it comes to preventing homelessness, because renovictions are in many ways the guise by which this displacement happens, right? A renoviction is a bad faith eviction under the guise of renovation. And what we find when jurisdictions actually do crack down on this, so Hamilton's bylaw is based on what New Westminster introduced a number of years ago, that actually all but eliminated renovictions in that community. So this is, again, one of the inspiring things. We actually know what can work if it has teeth behind it. And again, with this anti-renoviction bylaw in Hamilton, it's key to stress, you know, tenants have the right to return to a unit once renovations have taken place. That is not a new right. That is not a new right that Hamilton is giving tenants. What the bylaw is doing is basically coming up with a way to ensure that tenants can exercise that right. And if there are renovations that actually do require vacant possession, you know, major work, then there's a clear pathway for what will happen to the tenant in that time. The landlord has to provide either alternate accommodation or provide a rental top-up. And what that does is it actually binds the landlord and tenant together throughout that process. Renovictions thrive when tenants disappear, right? Come find us. Sure, you got the right to return. Come find us when it's done. What the Hamilton bylaw does is it says, no, landlord and tenant, here's how you are stuck together through that process. And that makes it very difficult for the tenant to disappear. So what it also does is call out the bad faith renovictions. So I'm very inspired by what Hamilton has done. Acorn Hamilton has been working closely with the city, as they were doing out in New Westminster and places like Burnaby, places that have strong tenant protections. We, you know, if you know where to look, we actually have the pieces of all of this together. They're all separate, but they exist from coast to coast to coast. Strong rent control, tenant protections, anti-renoviction bylaws, building a substantial amount of non-market housing, primarily on public land. These are not new ideas we need to think about. These are not, you know, we don't need to think of the solutions. We know the solutions. We actually need to just implement them, have the budget and the courage to implement them, and look at places that are doing it on a small scale or doing it in a one-off jurisdiction. And I think the solutions are kind of hiding in plain sight. We just need to look.
I have just a quick question to follow up on that. So I know that you said you lived in the Netherlands, and so in Europe there's lots of different, you know, the housing market, it differs country to country. Some places like England, I think it's still the case, you can evict someone without cause, that kind of thing. Is there anything? Netherlands is one of the places in the world that's had the longest history of social housing, I believe, right? Is there anything interesting to learn from Netherlands, or is it the same as what you were just saying in Canada?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, I focus a lot of my research on Canada, but I try and draw experiences and knowledge from other places. And when I talk about best practices in housing, I don't focus on the Netherlands today. And that comes as my experience researching housing there for a number of years, seeing a number of deliberate policies in several municipalities to actively reduce the share of social housing, seeing how social housing is being residualized. So what you have in the Netherlands, and there are other places, you know, I think, you know, a lot of attention goes to Vienna. They are very active today. A lot of French cities have very strong social housing requirements. Often a quarter of new housing in developments have to be social housing. Those are more inspiring places to look today. You know, you could go back to the 1990s in Amsterdam, and you could be on the waiting list for 2 years for a social housing flat in the middle of the city. 2 years is nothing, right? And then you have a flat, you don't have to leave, you can make more money. It's your flat, you can stay there. Within about a decade, that jumped to almost a decade.
Right.
It didn't happen naturally. It happened because of decisions that are made. And again, it's the same thing in this country. We've built great examples of social housing, of mixed income housing. The St. Lawrence neighborhood in downtown Toronto, built 50 years ago on public land, with about a third social housing, a third rental, a third owner occupied. It has stood the test of time. We need to be thinking, we need to be thinking about what we've done in the past and how we can revise that and update that. I'd say more so than looking to what, Vienna's done. Vienna had a history 100 years ago of socialist housing that we can't replicate. But we can look to what we've done in the past, and we can look to what we are doing now. There's a great example in Kitchener. The city used public land. I'm pretty sure about 5 years ago, people high up in City Hall didn't even know they owned, let alone thought of it as a spot for housing. And again, the way many of us in research and advocacy were sort of like, look, you've got land, do something with it. And the city partnered with the YW. They got rapid housing financing from the federal government, and now there are 2 buildings that provide supportive housing for women that were previously on the streets. Examples like that are really where we need to take inspiration from, because again, we're doing it in small pieces. We need to scale that up, and the billions that go into subsidizing market rate rental housing, a lot of that needs to go into non-market housing and genuinely affordable housing.
Very interesting. So I'm going to go to some of the questions here. Apparently in the chats, there's been lots of discussion, folks sharing their experiences from across Canada, similar things happening in small towns across Canada, but also the big centers. So one person wants to know, you put forward some proposals, like how can we influence the current situation? This person's from Alberta and says Alberta seems to be following the trend as well. There was a report in the media this week about the rising costs of housing in Alberta. So yeah, what can people do to help move this along? Anybody want to offer up?
Go ahead, Brian. I'll take after.
Vote. Tenants tend not to vote as much as homeowners. What can one person do? One person can vote, can organize with their community. And we see so much in the news today about housing. So much of it is about supply, and we just need to build more, right? We build our millions of new houses, we solve this problem. I can tell you as a housing researcher, that ain't going to work. First of all, we're not going to be able to build that scale of housing, and that housing is not going to be affordable. And the stuff that, might trickle down just isn't going to do it because of lack of rent control. So vote for people that are promising to invest in social housing, invest in tenant protection. I think that's a good way that one individual can really make, a difference if that is multiplied by millions of people who may not be voting in elections regularly.
That's good points.
I agree that the percentage of tenants across Ontario now is a huge voting bloc. It is hard, though, as we learned from our project, to convince people who've been marginalized and made vulnerable and scapegoated for a long time that voting is going to change anything in their life, because that is, what their experience is. It's been 40 years of bad experiences. I do think we have people reach out to us locally a lot of times from different areas across York Region saying, I want to get involved in what the Affordable Housing Coalition is doing. And we take that seriously, because we know we have positive housing rights focused people in municipalities across the region. Then we can have them come out when one municipality decides after 2 years of planning that, no, we really don't think the men's shelter should be built here, even though we have a high need for it. So we need the general public to help reshape the perception, because we know that individuals who experience this have internalized shame and blame and guilt and see this as an individual failure of themselves. So we really need to help them understand. And back again to something else Brian said, we won't build our way out of this, especially if we're building what this government is proposing that we build.
Yeah.
We need government housing, because right now, even anyone who's renting, low, middle income, like even housing, renting isn't a choice anymore. It's what people are forced to do. And it could be okay. It could be fine. Renting should cost less than having a mortgage. But people who are renting are looking at the future of no rent control and increases at the whim of the private landlords. And they don't feel secure in that at all. So we need government housing, and especially for the folks that we think about as at higher risk of homelessness, those that are homeless. There's a time coming, if it hasn't already arrived, when a certain segment of our population who should also benefit from the right to housing will have absolutely no options. I feel like it's here now, but it's only going to get worse. And the voting bloc that we listen to are those that are homeowners, and they don't have the same concerns. In fact, their concerns are very different and very focused on their own bottom line. So this could be a whole other webinar talking about what we need to do differently to prevent and educate people about what's really going on. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the financialization of housing. I think everyone needs to go out and get Ricardo Jan's book, The Tenant Class, and read that, because it's a much more accurate depiction of what's actually going on in the rental world today than anything I've read.
Dylyn.
Yeah. So I think just coming from a tenant side, building on this, I think we should all be doing eviction prevention. I saw somebody in the chat saying that they're from Kingston and they're an eviction prevention worker, and that work is incredible and amazing. I think the fact that we have discrete roles for eviction prevention, though, doesn't actually address the fact that we all can have this basic information and expertise to help somebody who's facing displacement now. I do not have a legal qualification, and yet in my role as a tenant organizer, I have helped a number of tenants address legal things, fill out forms. We have a system in Ontario that writes tenant law in common language for everybody to generally understand, with an idea that people who are unfamiliar with this can try and understand. Obviously, the law doesn't encompass everything, but if we are all familiar with eviction prevention, we all take a responsibility to act as peers engaged in eviction prevention in our community. This will strengthen our community. Tenant organizing and tenant unions are possible, despite the fact that there are immense pressures that tenants face that keep them silent, that limit their ability to speak up, and that limit their ability to articulate their rights. But at the end of the day, until we have governmental change, this is all we have. We have each other, we have other tenants, we have our neighbors in our neighborhoods. And together, I believe that with a common voice, we can actually change things. We've seen this happen a number of times. There are some amazing examples coming out of Toronto. We saw this as well in Cornwall, with tenants coming together to resist this eviction. We see this again with the peer-led eviction prevention in Oxford County. And we see this emerging in Kingston as well as York Region. We see a number of tenant initiatives emerging to support tenants. And I think if you're not a tenant, supporting this, strengthening this, bolstering these voices, going to city council and showing your support for tenants when they show up. And if you're a tenant, getting involved, speaking to your neighbors, connecting with tenant support groups in your community, or starting one yourself is a great first step.
That's great. Great answers. All of your different perspectives are both connected, but also articulated in certain ways. You're talking about legislation and policy and organizing and evictions prevention interventions. You know, we need like all of these things together. And
can I add something to that, Stephen? Can I add something? So locally, I think across Ontario, we have safety and well-being plans that are required by the province for municipalities to enact.
Right.
In neighborhoods where there is lower income, perhaps higher rates of crime. And so in York region, we have 4 such neighborhoods. And so I think what we need to do around those things is recognize and make politicians and staff aware that eviction prevention is one of the most important levers to making communities feel safer, more secure, to helping people be able to not just the word thrive always throws me off when we use the word thrive, but people are trying to survive. And this is one of the ways we can help them do it. So I think there might be small amounts of money. We need to look at governments at the local level to make money available for eviction prevention. We had some very small grants that we got, but it helped us get into neighborhoods where even if you have 1 or 2 people who say, I want to lead this work, and we can pay individuals to help door knock and outreach and flyer and direct people to some of the resources, even though the resources are sparse, we need to build that understanding. So I think that's one thing. And I had one other thing, and I don't remember. Oh, I think the other thing is, personally, everybody has to get really, really good and familiar with the language and the evidence behind disputing the idea that more housing is going to solve this problem, especially the type of housing we're building. You have to be able to debunk that. And again, Ricardo's book is really good for that, to be able to stand up and say 40 years of this mindset around rent control will only lessen the building of more rental units is not true. But also it takes into account that it's government-owned housing is going to solve this problem, not market rent housing alone at all.
Yeah, I agree with that point. And I think we have, a history in Canada that went, post-war period right up to the late 80s, where there was, building 18,000, 20,000 units of housing a year. We have a history of co-op housing as a model, and yet our strategies and investments don't seem to follow our own history of what's possible. So any sense of like what's getting in the way of that? And that'll be my last question. Why can't we learn from our own past?
Follow the money, Steve. I don't know what else to say. The political solutions are there.
Right.
Why is it we're not doing this? And I think anything that needs to happen does require a lot of political pressure. But it's very disheartening to see, even at the federal level, roll out like a lot, like Brian talked about it. We're subsidizing private developers to build housing that will only be affordable for a very short time. Why are we not screaming at the top of our lungs about this? Right? It's such a short-term band-aid subsidy to private developers. And I think we have to realize that something else is going on here. And if you watch The Shift, Leilani Farah's movie, and look at The Shift, you understand globally what's happening. And there's monstrous amounts of money being made by REITs and anyone who owns property at the, and the downfall of that is that more and more people won't be able to even afford to rent. So I think we have to really get political. We have to really look, and we have to hold people accountable, and we have to become very literate in talking about this, so that you can't just have someone look at you and go, well, you really don't understand. It's very complex. That's been a problem for many years. It's complex, but it's also simple at the same time. The solutions are there, as Brian said.
That's right. That's a great closer. Brian, do you want to add anything, or Dylyn? Okay, Brian?
No, I think we're good.
Can I add one thing? I think at the end of the day, it's prioritizing tenants' needs that really needs to take political precedent. We see there's a balancing that has to happen between landlords and tenants, of course. At the end of the day, this is essential. But right now, we cannot have this debate about whose needs are more important when it's having access to safe, affordable, and sanitary housing compared to making profit on a business. Right? We can't balance these things. One is a right. We have a right to housing, and one is a business. And so we need to treat landlording like a business. We need to hold landlording to the same standards, and we cannot elect over and over again to prioritize business interests over human rights. We see this in Kingston, we see this in Oxford County, we see this in New York region, we see this in Cornwall, we see this across Canada, across Ontario. And so I think I want to echo Yvonne's point, like holding this political pressure onto the people that we've elected, who've promised that they would respect human rights, who've promised they'd champion the rights of tenants, but who haven't followed through on that, to be more courageous, to stand up for tenants, and to articulate clearly that this is not a equal terrain. This is completely uneven. And at the end of the day, human rights really do matter for tenants.
I see there's a lot of thumbs up right now. Well, I want to thank our three presenters. This was an amazing conversation. I totally respect the work that all of you are doing to try and change things. And so keep going. And again, thank you. Over.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, there we go.
Sorry, everyone. We've gotten a little strange with the settings here, but I did want to say we actually have just a little bit of time left. So if you had wanted to do a quick fire on one more question, we could squeeze it in.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So I can just go ahead and pick one from the audience here. So the last question we can pick from the audience today is, this person says, my question is, how can a socially responsible business partner with the non-for-profit housing sector to speed up the introduction of housing? Right now, there seems to be substantial red tape, even in the non-for-profit sector, in the implementation of housing projects. So maybe we'll all try and do it in like a sentence or two. Dylyn, I'll start with you. You're first on my screen.
So this is not my primary area of expertise, so I might just be a little bit general with this, but certainly there's an area for reinvestment in our communities that needs to be prioritized, especially when we see things such as new developments happening in our community. Business is essential to revitalize and like re-inject some of that money into our communities. We can see this through things such as like community land trusts or community benefit agreements. I know a lot of nonprofit or third sector housing in our community has relied on private support to get off the ground, and that has been critical and essential. And a lot of these are done informally through grassroots partnerships. They're reaching out, talking to people, and asking, "What do you need?" And so, if you are a business owner, if you are interested in investing in nonprofit housing, I would suggest looking to where you are in your community, looking around, seeing the people who are also interested in doing this, because with a little bit of education, with a little bit of training or expertise from somebody who has done this before, this is possible in your community.
Thanks for that. So yeah, what I'm hearing is like, there's people who know how to do this. It's just a matter of being deliberate about getting connected. Thank you for sharing that. Any thoughts to add, Brian?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, if we're talking about new housing supply, even if it's working with the not-for-profit sector, or even with the government sector, a lot of that housing has historically and will continue into the future, will be built by for-profit private developers. And I think it's important to distinguish different roles of, people who build housing, people who speculate on land, people who manage existing housing, right? Like there are a number of different actors, public, private, nonprofit, that are at various stages of the housing process. And again, probably just, to end, just echoing Dylyn's point of, if you are looking to get into affordable housing in whatever capacity that you represent or whatever organization you represent, the first step should be actually to look at what's already going on within your community, because there's a lot. There's a lot of grassroots organizations. There's a lot of tenant organization. There's a lot of nonprofits. I mean, we have a lot of nonprofits in this country, and maybe that is actually one of the challenges, because a lot of them are very, very small. But we have a lot of people and organizations already in this space. And if you're looking to get involved, the first step would be to listen to what's already going on and figure out how you can contribute to the things that are already happening. rather than coming in and saying, I got this grand idea and everyone should work with me and you should be grateful that I'm investing, my time or energy or philanthropic time. Listen to the folks that have been doing this, that are on the ground. And I think that's where great partnerships come from.
Wow, there's a lot there. I think one of the things we've talked about in the region is the fact that it is such a difficult thing for not-for-profits to get into the housing world because they don't have all the lawyers, they don't have all the money that goes into the upfront investment that needs to be made, and that's even before you get approved to build something. So if you're a business, or if you're a business who's interested in getting into the world of housing, I wholeheartedly agree that you need to find out what's going on in your own community, because I can tell you there's probably a not-for-profit developer already struggling to get some of their ideas launched, and working with them could make that possible. I think as a business person, for good or for bad, your voice is often heard a lot more loudly at council and at regional and municipal council. Being able to articulate why it's important for you to see affordable housing in your community so that you can attract and retain employees and build a healthy community is so important. It's interesting because the same thing I would say, you would say, and probably be heard much more openly by those who are making decisions. So I think there's a big role for advocacy. And if you want to run for council, in addition to working at that local business, we need more people in government positions at the local level who speak about this from a very, very passionate place. So a few things. And if you're in Ontario and you're not sure who to connect with, you can reach out to Social Planning Network of Ontario, because we do have, like I said, we have 13 organizations in different parts, all the way from Thunder Bay to Ottawa to Hamilton. And so we can actually help you with that. And I can put my email address in the chat.
On that incredible, wonderful, and powerful note, I'm going to close us out for the day. Thank you so very much for joining us all. You'll see that I have put our contact information up on the screen. So as Yvonne mentioned, her email is in the chat, but if you're missing it for whatever reason, or maybe you're rewatching this on YouTube, please do reach out via our contact information that I've put up on the screen right now if you'd like to get further connected, and we'll handle that for you accordingly. Thank you so much for everybody in the chat today for being super, super, super engaged and leading us to need to stay on longer just to get to everything you had to say, because this has been such a powerful conversation. To Steve for hosting, thank you so much. Yvonne, Dylyn, Brian, it has been incredible to hear from you today. And what I've heard from you and also heard from our chat below is that things are stark right now. As some of my Gen Z peers might say, it's looking a little scary. However, we have been here before and we know how to solve this because we have evidence of it in the past. And so when it comes to looking forward, it sounds like what I've heard today, both in the chat and from all of you, is that we just need to get connected to the people who are really doing this work on the ground and be more deliberate about making use of what we can when it comes to our political spaces to really just move this work forward. So I appreciate you sharing all of that with us so much today. It's been a great session. I did want to flag that next month's session is going to be our last session for a little bit, because we'll be going on hiatus for the summer, because as many people in the research world do, we'll be taking the summer off to just kind of recharge and recenter. But we'll be back in the fall after June session with even more powerful talks for you. Before we close out though, June is National Indigenous History Month. And so I'm really excited to share that we'll be having a really powerful conversation that's going to be focused on Indigenous homelessness prevention, or more accurately, houselessness prevention. And if that term is new to you or sounds unfamiliar, then you would probably benefit greatly from, coming to enjoy and listen with us. Sorry, I just see someone in the chat saying that researchers do not take the summer off. We slow down a little.
That's right.
Apologies for that. We slow down a little more. I misspoke. I did not mean fully off the same way people go on vacation. But yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Anyway, yes, we're done for today, but thank you all so much for joining us again. Once more, please do use our contact information if you'd like to get connected with any of these wonderful people any further. And in the meantime, we just wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're calling in from. And we will hopefully see you at another one of these very soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.